In this video, we are going to see some security features of COMMANDO C2000, E2000, I2000 series L2 plus switches. Let's start. Take the access of the switch by a username admin and password COMMANDO. The AAA features allows you to verify the identity and grant access and track actions of users. This series switch supports remote access dial-in user service radius or terminal access controller access control device plus TechS plus protocols. And the three security authentication functions can be summarized as authentication, authorization and accounting. This authentication identifies user that requests access to the network. Authorization determines if user can access the specific service, and accounting provide report, auditing and billing for service that users have access on the network. The AAA functions require the use of configured radius or TechS plus server in the network. The security server can be defined as a sequential group that are applied as a method for controlling user access to specified services. When the switch attempts to authenticate, a user request is sent to the first server in defined group. If no response from the first server, then second server will be tried and so on. If at any point pass or fail is written, the process stops. So we will add a login authentication list to authenticate with the order of TechS plus and radius local servers. So let's start with configure terminal. The command is AAA authentication login and login name, let us say test1, TechS plus radius local. So existing login authentication list can be seen, and this by show AAA authentication login list. So by default there is a login list for this device. So default is a login list and method is local. We have created new authentication method called as test1 with TechS plus and radius as a local. Different access methods are allowed to bind different login authentication list. Use login authentication commands to bind the list to specific line like console, telnet, SSH. So I will bind one line. So we have to go to configuration of the switch, configure terminal, AAA authentication login test1. So I will create test1 for line console. So in line console I can have the login authentication test1. So this will have the effect that new login authentication list will be binded to the console line. So show line list will show what are the line. So you can see that login test1 enable is default, that new login test1 AAA type is created. Next example, we will show how to create new login authentication list for HTTP and HTTPS access. So configure terminal, AAA authentication login test1 TechS plus and radius local. This is our method for test 1. Then AAA authentication login test 2 radius local. Then IP HTTP login authentication test 1 and IP HTTPS login authentication test 2. So show lines list will show this new method of login test 1 and test 2. Here you can see that. So you can create a new enable authentication list and bind to telnet line. So we can also have the enable authentication for a line telnet or line console by enable authentication test 1. So you can also modify default TechS plus configuration. For that you have to go to configure terminal. Configure terminal, TechS default configure. Let us say I want to make the timeout after 20 seconds. If no TechS server is found, it will time out. Or I can have the TechS default config key. Let us say tag key. This is the key name which I defined. So I have changed now the default configuration of TechS from to new timeout and new key. We can also modify the radius configurations. So configure terminal, default configuration of radius. Radius default config timeout 20 and radius default config key, let us say radius key. So similarly we can also verify these with the command show radius default config. Show radius default config. So you can see that we have changed that default config of the radius. You can also have the new radius server. Let us say we can have radius server on port number 192 on IP 192.168.1.111. So we can define that also. So go to config terminal and create a radius server. IP address authentication port also we can have. Let us say I am 65001 is my authentication port. Key radius key which we have created, and priority I can set, let us say 100. Retransmit after 5, timeout 10 and type all. So show radius server will show the priority IP address, authentication port, retries, type and key used. So this is a very simple and straightforward to configure radius TechS for line, for enable passwords and on. Next is we will go for ACL. ACL is a sequential collection of permit and deny condition that applies to packet. Packet filtering can help limit network traffic and restrict network use by certain users or certain devices. An ACL contains an order list of access control entries, ACEs. Each ACE specifies permit and deny and sets the condition the packet must satisfy in order to match the ACA. The switch support L4 and L3, IPv4 as well as IPv6 ACL and Ethernet MAC ACLs. So we can create the ACLs and we can apply to the interface. So first of all, we will create MAC ACL. For that we have to go to configuration of the switch with configure T command, then MAC ACL. This is the ACL we are creating. After that we will create the AC sequence 20 permit any. In ACLs, if I permit one, then that only will be allowed, other will be denied. And let us say deny. I can deny any MAC address having MAC address starting with AA colon CC colon colon 00 with FF colon FF colon FF colon 00 colon 00 colon 00 VLAN, let us say 1 shutdown. So I have create a deny statement for a range of MAC addresses for VLAN 1. So this MAC ACL I have created. Show ACL will show this MAC ACL. So MAC access list I have created, name test with sequence number 20 permit all, and sequence number 40 deny any MAC address starting with this entire range, and VLAN 1 will be making those MAC address shutdown. So after creating this, we will apply to the interfaces. First we will create the ACLs. Second is we will create the IP ACLs. Let us say we will create the IP v4 based ACL for layer 3 ACL. So we have to go to configuration, IP ACL test, IP ACL, let us say I will have IP test, deny IP 192.168.1.80 /255.255.255.0 and any. Then I can see this ACL by giving show ACL command. So I have created this ACL. Let us say I want to create a IPv6 based ACL named IPv6 test. So I can also do that by giving the command IPv6 ACL IPv6 test, and I want to deny IPv6 FE80 1/64 and then permit any. So do show ACL will show us IPv6 ACL. So after creating ACL and ACE, we have to bind it with the interfaces. So the command to bind with the interfaces is configure terminal interface. Let us say I want to bind to G1 interface. So IP ACL IP test. So this will be binded. Oh, spelling this. IP ACL IP test. So this will be binded to this interface. Next section we will see authentication manager implementation that delegate responsibility for authentication to one or more authentication providers. The authentication manager port setting page control all authentication methods such as 802.1x MAC authentication. It also handles network authentication request and enforces authentication per port basis. The authentication manager maintains operational data for all port based network connection. Use MAC based authentication to authenticate device based on their physical media access control addresses, and web based authentication to authenticate user on switches by redirecting web page requests to login page that require user to input a valid username and password before they can access the network. Web based local account can be defined as the process of verifying someone's identity by using pre-required detail, commonly username and password. 802.1x port-based network access control (PNAC) provides authentication mechanism for devices seeking to access LAN. During this authentication process, the switch complete multiple message exchange between the end device and authentication server, while 802.1x authentication is in progress. Only 802.1x traffic and control traffic can transit in the network. Let us have MAC based, web based and 802.1x based authentication enabled for this switch. So go to the configuration with configure terminal, give the command authentication. You can see DOT1x, guest VLAN, MAC and web based. So we can enable any of the authentication as per our requirements. So let us say we will go for DOT1x, then guest VLAN, DOT1x, MAC and web based authentications. We can also enable this on interfaces also. Let us say interface G1, we want to enable this authentication web, authentication MAC and authentication DOT1x. So we can also enable on the interfaces. We can also configure MAC authentication radius ID format to uppercase with the colon delimiter every 2 characters. So for that we have to go to configuration, authentication, MAC radius, MAC case, upper, and authentication, MAC radius, MAC delimiter, colon, gap 2. We can give the command show authentication to verify our authentication. So you can see that the configured, we have enabled the authentication, we have our format, then we have enabled this, and order also we have enabled. We can also add a new local MAC authentication host for this host. So we have to go to configure terminal, authentication, MAC local, we can have any of the MAC, control auth, let us say on VLAN 1, re-authentication period 500, inactive timeout 300. So we have done with that. We can also create the guest, authentication guest VLAN 1. So we can have other VLAN. We have to create the VLAN 3. So show authentication, will show the local MAC auth local entry, authorize VLAN 1 with retry timeout, inactivity timeout, and so on. We can also have modify the port authentication order as well as to any of the DOT1X Max or web-based authentication. So for that we have to go to configuration, interface G2, let us say, authentication method local radius, and we can also have authentication order also change, let us say MAC DOT1X first, then MAC, and then web. We can also reject VLAN assign. So authentication radius attribute VLAN reject. We can also re-authenticate with the help of authentication reauth. We can also create a timeout for inactivity, authentication timer inactive, let us say 300. We can also have all these things seen with the command show authentication interface G2. So we can see the configured things. Type order, re-authentication, and other VLAN assign mode reject and all. We can add and delete new local account. So for that we have to go to configuration, configure terminal, authentication, web local, username, let us say accounting 1, CCT1, let us say this is a name, and password for that ACCT1, VLAN 3, re-authentication period, let us say 301, and inactive 600. We can also go to the interface and can configure authentication web maximum login attempts to, let us say, 5. The switch support, this switch, all this configuration can be seen with the command show authentication interface G2. So we can see that the configured things with the help of these commands. The switch support 802.1x DOT1X port based access control that prevent unauthorized access to network by requiring users to first submit credential for authentication. Client authentication is controlled centrally by Radius server using EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol. So let's configure how to enable 802.1x authentication. So configure terminal, then DOT1x, enter. So show authentication will show this is enabled for the interfaces. You can create a DOT1x guest VLAN also. You can also have the EAP transmit period. So DOT1x max DOT1x. You can have, you have to go to interface G2, max request, let us say 2. Then we also can have enable port re-authentication for particular port. So configure terminal, interface G2, DOT1x, timeout, re-authentication period, let us say 300 seconds. We can also have a quiet period for DOT1x, timeout, quiet period after non-entering of or after non-authentication. You have to wait for this much time. We can also have server timeout. So DOT1x, timeout 150, let us say. Then we can also have a supplicant timeout, which we have configured, and we also can have EAP TX period, transmit period. TX period, let us say 10 seconds. All this can be seen with the help of two commands. All this config show authentication. You can see whatever configuration you have done for authentication servers, and for particular port or range of port, show authentication interface, whatever interface or range of interface, you can see this authentication. Thank you.